Welcome to Building the Future. I'm your host, Kevin Horick. I'll be interviewing startups, entrepreneurs, investors, CEOs, and others that are involved in following their dreams and helping to make our world a better place. Today on the show, we have Glenn Plaskin. He's a best-selling author and veteran celebrity interviewer specializing in writing in-depth interviews for magazines and newspapers, celebrity memoirs, and self-help and inspirational-orientated books. Welcome, Glenn. Thanks for being on the show. Like I mentioned in your biography, you have quite the impressive profile. So I just want to, kind of give our audience a little bit more of a background on you and kind of find out, where you grew up and, went to school and that kind of thing. Maybe we'll start there.
Thank you for having me today. I have an old joke I always tell, which is you read all that stuff off, and I always tell my mom, gee, I did so much with so little, because when I was in grade school growing up in Buffalo, New York, the principal brought me in the office one day and told my mom and me that I had a very low IQ and that garbage collectors could be happy too. And my mother was very upset with me, and I did get bad grades up until around ninth grade because I wasn't really paying attention much, and I was in another zone, so to speak. But back in those days, people thought if you tested badly, that meant you weren't very intelligent. So I remember going to the drugstore and looking at all these magazines about famous people, and I thought to myself, wouldn't that be weird that years later that would be my job, interviewing famous people? And, it's ranged from first ladies, like Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis and Nancy Reagan, to movie stars like Meryl Streep or Elizabeth Taylor, or newsmaking people like Donald Trump or Leona Helmsley, or self-help kinds of people like Tony Robbins and Deepak Chopra, and even the corporate interviews I've done with like the CEOs of IBM and Pepsi and other companies. So I find it ironic that a kid like me, who was so shy, with very little confidence, who did not perform well academically or athletically, I thought, well, what are you going to do with him? So it's just funny that I wound up actually, journalism and book writing became a passport, you might say, to meeting people that I otherwise would never have met.
Sure. I kind of feel that same way about the radio show. There's a lot of people that I've gotten to reach out to that I never would have had the opportunity to if it wasn't for the show. So I totally get that.
Yeah, so I always tell people, if I could do it, you could do it.
Totally. A lot of people are just almost like scared to ask in a lot of ways. That's how I got a lot of the things that I've accomplished, and it sounds like you're kind of in the similar boat, right? Like you just went for it one day, right?
Well, you asked me before, how did I get into writing, and that was not my goal or interest in any way. I had no interest in becoming a writer. During my childhood, I was being trained to be a pianist.
Really? Interesting.
I started when I was 8 years old, and by the time I was about 13, I was pretty serious, and by the time I was 15, I decided I wanted to be a classical concert pianist, and by the time I was 17, I was auditioning for conservatories of music and spent 9 years going to 2 different conservatories of music for college. So when people say, well, what background do you have for writing? I tell them none.
Wow, that's awesome.
But when I was 25, I realized I made a mistake. So you see, the decisions you sometimes make when you're a teenager about what you want to do with your life don't necessarily hold later. And by the time I was 25, I realized that I didn't want to do this and that I actually wasn't going to make it as a concert pianist despite my abilities. So what I did is I had an idea for a book, just out of the blue, about who was at that time the most famous classical pianist in the world, named Vladimir Horowitz. And I came to New York with no friends and no money and no experience. And I started calling publishers on my own, just telling them I had this idea for a book. And there'd never been a book about him. And I got all these people interested, including Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis, who was a editor at that time at Doubleday Publishers. So then I went to the William Morris Agency, the talent company, and I told them I wanted to write this book, and they said, well, what have you written? I said, nothing. And they said, well, what do you have to show us? I said, nothing, except my list of 14 publishers that were interested. Well, to make a long story short, I was told to go write a book proposal. I didn't even know what a book proposal was, but I somehow went and did it. And when I came back, believe it or not, within 6 months of moving to New York City, I had sold that book idea to a major publisher in the U.S. and to another publisher in England. And for the next 3 years, I was writing that book. And the first thing I did was call up the New York Times and told them, I'm now writing this book, and I'd like to write an article for you. And they said, well, what idea do you have? And I told them the idea. And that was the first article I ever had published. And,
wow.
And all I'm trying to say by telling you this story is that back then, when I had so little, I was thinking really big. I thought, well, since you have no experience, you might as well try to start at the top. And oddly enough, people were receptive to me, and I did hire a writing teacher to teach me how to do it better, and I hired a research assistant, and I got the help I needed. And when the book was published, the first book, it was on the front page of the New York Times, the London Times, the LA Times, the Chicago Tribune.
Wow.
It was all over the country. And suddenly I remember being on a book tour, sitting in the Beverly Hills Hotel one day and thinking, gee, how did this happen? You know, a few years earlier, I was a broke piano student who was going to wind up teaching other people how to play the piano. And now I'm on a book tour.
That's
so I always
awesome.
tell people that if you don't think you can do it, I mean, maybe you can and maybe you can't, but all I'm saying is you have to try, you know.
Totally. So I'm curious then, did you got kind of an upfront payment to write the book, or were you working full-time during that period, or how did you kind of support yourself while you were writing the book? Because you said it took 3 years to write that?
Oh, I wasn't working at all. I was working on the book. Yes, a publisher pays what's called an advance.
Okay.
And so I was living on the advance, and it was fairly considerable because the agent had done a good job selling it. So yes, I was living on the book money, and I was writing the book. And then when I finished writing the book, by that point I was broke again. And then I got lucky, which is that my agent found me a niche writing for Playboy magazine. My first interview was a long format interview with Calvin Klein, the designer.
Wow, that's impressive.
And that began a series of interviews that included many, celebrities. But the first one was Calvin Klein. And in fact, after the interview was published, he liked me, and he actually got me my first writing job, which was at W magazine.
Wow.
A full-time job. And that was like going to college for me because they sent me all over the country. I was interviewing everyone from first ladies to college, university presidents, doing stories about artists and conductors and painters and politicians. And it was really a good training ground for me. And then slowly I became known for writing celebrity profiles in national magazines. And there were many, it was Carol Burnett and Elizabeth Taylor and Joan Collins and all kinds of people. And that led eventually to my writing full-time for the New York Daily News, where I had my own syndicated column that was syndicated by the Tribune Company. And the column was called Turning Point. And it was about how famous people face crisis in their life and what they learned from it and how they overcame it. So every Monday next to Ann Landers, there would be a column by me that would have an interview with a famous person about how they overcame a crisis. And eventually this became a book called Turning Point, Pivotal Moments in the Lives of America's Celebrities. And Oprah did a show on it, and Joan Rivers did a show on it, and Larry King did, and Sally Jesse Raphael, and all these people who at the time had talk shows. And so that was my second book, based on 120 celebrities that I had interviewed about how they overcame crisis in their life. So that gives you a little portrait of what happened to me. So Oprah did an entire show on the concept of Turning Point, and we got 4 or 5 people to come on the show, famous people, to talk about moments in their lives that affected them deeply. So, and each one of those people did a whole show on it. So it was exciting for me, considering how low my IQ was.
Do you still play the piano or music at all, or are you kind of just completely done with that?
Well, it kind of faded away. I was playing for a long time, but much less so. You know, I went from practicing 6 hours a day to not practicing at all.
Sure.
And honestly, whatever need it was fulfilling during childhood and during my 20s, it must have gone away because I really don't miss it much. But it's still part of me. I find myself sometimes, if I'm in a waiting room somewhere, my fingers start moving. I'll be playing a piece, you know, on a magazine, and there are all these things still going on in my head that I remember. So the physical syntax of, you know, moving your fingers and playing, I guess you could say I'm using my fingers on the keyboard of the computer now. But getting back to the networking thing, that long before social media, long before LinkedIn and you know, Facebook and Twitter, I was networking unconsciously without really knowing what I was doing, but I was asking for help all along the way. I said to Calvin Klein, I need a job. And he literally picked up the phone and called the CEO of the company and said, I'm sending someone over. You've got to interview him. And I literally went over that day. And
That's
I got
incredible.
the job a few days later. Or when Calvin Klein said, I said, listen, I want to have an interview with Diana Ross. He picked up the phone and he called her for me. Or he picked up the phone and he called the White House and got me an interview with the then First Lady. And later, when I wanted to interview him on television for the Today Show, he did that for me as well, kind of as a favor, because I didn't have much experience in television. So, you know, one person can lead to another, and oftentimes people will doubt you. Even when I was hired at the Daily News, they doubted that I could deliver all the celebrities that I said I could. But honestly, I myself wasn't sure I could. I'm never sure I can. But when I was hired, I felt I had to. And so I actually did, whether it was Sylvester Stallone or Meryl Streep or Al Pacino or Robert De Niro or all these different people I went to interview, or Harrison Ford and others I can't remember. I just forced myself to do it, and I had lots of adventures along the way. I spilled orange juice on Harrison Ford by accident. Yes, I reached out to touch his hand, and I knocked over this carafe of orange juice, and it got all over him. But he was a very good sport. And when Elizabeth Taylor came down the staircase to meet me, she was wearing that huge Krupp diamond, and I said to her, is that it? And she said, yeah, would you like to touch it? And she took her ring off and threw it at me, tossed it to me, and I held it. And then I remember saying to her, your skin is just beautiful. And she said, would you like to touch it? So she had me touching her face, and I said, what's your secret? And she said, sesame oil. She put sesame oil on everything. And there were just these little vignettes that, you know, you remember. Or I remember when I was in Lionel Richie's house, he had recently won an Oscar for one of his songs, and I had never held an Oscar. Well, in my scrapbook, I have a great Polaroid picture of me and Lionel Richie with me holding his Oscar.
That's awesome. That's incredible. So do you keep in touch with a lot of these celebrities that you've, you know, kind of talked to throughout the years, especially like Calvin Klein and them?
Oh, yes. As recently as a few years ago, when my book about my dog came out, Calvin Klein hosted the book party, and Judge Judy was there, and
really,
and all these other people that I always keep in touch with the people, you know, that I've interviewed. And in fact, one thing I always tell, you know, writers is that you're going to need testimonials from other people about your work. So, for example, if you look at my website, like katiebook.com, you'll see there are testimonials from Judge Judy and from Mariah Carey and Donald Trump, and Mary Tyler Moore, and all kinds of people, Betty White. Those are all people that I don't know socially. I know them all from interviewing them.
Right. Okay. No, that's cool. Because yeah, I've definitely obviously checked out your sites and whatnot, and I'm sure you guys see each other, like you said, at parties, and it's pretty cool that Calvin Klein threw you a book launch party at his place. That's incredible, right?
Um, yes, it was. It was like a dream come true, and I'm always, I'm not really terribly confident, even now. I'm always
Really?
surprised. Oh yes, I'm surprised. I'll say, "Oh wow, did I do that?" Because to me, I still feel a little like that kid from Buffalo who was standing in the magazine shop, just dreaming one day of meeting somebody like that. Um, so I don't even. Anyway, that's how I. So it is kind of a strange story that I grew up playing the piano and wanted to be a professional musician, which I was, and then I did transfer into writing, which was really truly accidentally, because after all, a lot of people go to journalism school with the hopes of getting jobs at newspapers and magazines. And I went into magazines and newspapers with absolutely no training and no credits. No one ever taught me how to interview anybody. I taught myself how to pretty much do it.
Sure.
So I think a lot of it is intuition and instinct, and also a lot of it is preparation. I recently did an interview with the former police commissioner of New York, Ray Kelly, and it was an 8,000-word interview. I did weeks of research before. I had entire pages single-spaced on just one topic to cover, because if you're going to interview someone, you must be prepared. I'd rather have too many questions than not enough.
Yeah, because it's easy to cut some out, right? Or schedule a follow-up interview to cover the rest or whatnot.
Well, you have to know how to skip from one to the next in the right order. Yeah, sometimes with celebrities, you don't get a second chance.
Sure, yeah, fair
It
enough.
has to happen in that 1 hour or 45 minutes. You get one chance, so you got to give it your best shot.
No, totally makes sense. So I'm curious, though, you mentioned kind of you've been ghostwriting and stuff like that. How did you really get into that? Like, did like just writing for magazines kind of, move into that?
No.
Or
I got into that the same way I got into writing, really by accident. I had no intention of being a ghostwriter. After all, everything I was writing was under my byline, right?
Sure.
So I had interviewed somebody famous for Family Circle magazine, and before the article came out, I decided to just call him up on the phone and read the final result to him. And he said to me, "Oh, I'm looking for someone to help me write a book. Are you interested?" So I said, "Oh, okay." So he said, "Send me over your stuff." So I sent over this big pile of interviews to his hotel. And to make a long story short, that was my first ghostwriting job. He flew me to a variety of places to work with him. We worked in Australia and Fiji and Vancouver and Palm Springs. And we worked together for 15 months. And that was the first ghostwriting project I did. And then after that, I did another one, a Christian-based book called The Power to Change Today, which was a self-help inspiration kind of book. And then I realized that that was another aspect of writing that I could do, because whether you have a byline or you don't, the process is more or less the same. When you're ghostwriting, you have to interview the person extensively, right, or take printed materials they may already have, or their own writings, and you have to somehow synthesize all that material into a narrative that is compelling. And I found I could do it. So I created a business. My website for that is ghostwriteyourbook.com. And it's interesting that I did a little research, and 81% of all Americans say they have a book inside them. That's
really?
Like 200 million people who aspire, to the literary limelight, and yet only a very few people actually complete a book. But now, with the advances in social media and self-publishing, which is no longer a vanity process, you can actually write your own book and have it marketed and seen on Amazon and Barnes and Noble, and you can market it through social media and get it out there in a way that you never could have done 30 years ago.
Sure.
So there's a whole business now for people who are public speakers or corporate executives who want to use a book, for example, as a marketing tool that broadens their platform. It's like a tangible promotional calling card, that you can just give someone for back-of-the-room sales at conferences, meetings, or speaking engagements. And then other people want to write a book, like some of my clients, for their legacy. They may be getting older, and they want an accurate record of their life and their experience, something that they can give to their family, friends, and business associates. And then there are other people like celebrities who want a book to set the record straight.
Sure. No, that makes total sense.
So there's a whole bunch of options out there, and it's just another dimension to writing, and it's something that I found I could do. So that's how I kind of got into it. I seem to get into everything by accident, don't I?
So I'm curious though, when you're doing research for people, do you traditionally kind of follow them around for weeks or months or years at a time, or do they kind of just send you stuff? Do they try writing some of the book themselves and then want you to kind of just edit it? I'm a little bit curious about how that whole kind of process works, or is it kind of different per person?
Well, it is different for each situation. In one case, for example, the person I was working with had a lot of transcripts from his public speaking engagements already, literally notebooks of transcripts. And then he would dictate into a tape recorder each chapter idea for me. And so by the time I listened to his dictation and read the notebook, I was able to write a first draft of the chapter on my own.
Okay.
Then I would travel to him wherever he was. We would sit down in front of the computer and read it out loud, and then start changing it, enhancing it, and editing it together. And it would go through 4 or 5 or 6 different versions before one chapter was finished. So it's a time-consuming process. So that took 15 months. Other times, I've written a book in just 5 months with someone who, for example, would send me his sermons, and based upon the sermons and our book outline, I would again write the chapter out of my own head, and then we would go over it together, and he would add into it things that he wanted. And again, it would go through multiple drafts. Sometimes for memoirs, I interview someone. I don't have to be with them. I don't have to travel at all. We can do the entire thing on the phone. Interviews on the phone that are recorded and transcribed, and then those interviews form the basis for the chapters. And again, once I compose the whole chapter, I send it to them. We go over it, we change it, we go back and forth, and eventually it goes through editing and copy editing, and until there's hopefully no mistakes in it. And so each one is different.
Is there usually a publisher involved before you even kind of get started, or you're kind of looking for a publisher throughout the process, or kind of
I'm not looking for a publisher at all. Remember, I'm just the ghostwriter.
Okay, so it's up to the client
books.
then.
I don't publish books. I don't market books.
Right.
I don't even edit books.
My job. Okay, interesting.
No, my job is to do the writing. Now, with celebrities, sometimes they already have a publisher. Because remember, to sell a book to a commercial publisher, you need what's called a book proposal. Sometimes people hire me to write those first.
Okay.
But whether or not they have a publisher or they're going to self-publish, in the end, you must write the book anyway.
Sure.
So what I do is I refer clients to companies who specialize in self-publishing. In other words, they take the manuscript and they copy edit it. Then they create a cover for the book. They have a design for the interior of the book. They register the book with the Library of Congress. They get it on Amazon and elsewhere. There are companies that do self-publish book marketing. Lots of companies that do it. So if you are someone out there who wants to write a book about anything, it could be about your family history, It could be about just about anything. There are companies who can publish it. And on my website, I talk about a couple different categories. For example, there's the autobiography or memoir. Those are books for people who want to capture their life experience. I get lots of letters from people who either have come out of jail or they've gone through drug addiction or terrible tragedy, and they want to write a book about how they survived it. It's almost like it's cathartic that they want to do it. Then there are people who want to write inspiration. I mean, there's a huge market out there for self-help and inspirational books.
Sure.
And that's a whole category unto itself. Those two are my specialty: autobiography and inspiration. That's my background. Then there are psychology books, books about relationships and recovering from life challenges and getting rid of old habits and feeling happier. That's another specialty of mine. And then there's health and diet and exercise. That I haven't really written as much about, but it's something that I've written in magazines a lot, about the mind, the body, and the soul. And then there are business excellence books. There are a lot of business people out there who want a book summarizing, their leadership principles and vision. So, but no matter what the book, there's a couple things that you always need. You need a narrative that's going to be compelling and interesting to read. You've got to begin with an introduction, that will kind of seduce the reader. You need a hook for the whole book that's going to really make people wake up and pay attention. And for a ghostwriter, of course, you have to capture the voice of your subject. I can't use my voice. I'm trying to use their words,
Sure. So you kind of try to be in their shoes, kind of, and write as if they were writing it?
Yes. You may not even like their style, but if they hire you, you got to use their style, not yours. Sometimes I will admit I use a blend of them and me.
Sure. And
they seem to like it. But if they don't like it, then you've got to capture, their voice. And you got to paint a picture, that's punchy and emotional, and got to keep the action moving and build to the book's climax.
Sure.
So those are just some general things about ghostwriting that are important. Like, for example, if I'm writing a magazine article, I kind of know how to do it. If I'm writing a memoir, I shift into that, channel. If I'm writing a blog for my website, I shift into that. When I wrote my own book, it's called Katie Up and Down the Hall, and it's a true story based upon an article that was published in Family Circle. That was the most personal and emotional thing I ever did. See, the one thing I never do is write about myself. I never, ever did that.
Why is that?
Well, I just was always hired to, do interviews with celebrities or to write books about other things, but nobody ever asked me to write about myself, and I never did. But for Family Circle, I once wrote an article about the relationship that developed in my life. I live in New York City in a high-rise building that's right on the Hudson River opposite the New World Trade Center.
Okay.
And it's very scenic here, and there's thousands of people. And the idea was there was this woman down the hall who was in her 80s. She and her husband had never had children, and I became extremely close to them. They became like grandparents. And then further down the hall, there was a little 3-year-old kid, a boy who didn't have a mom, but he had a dad.
Okay.
And so this older woman who had never been able to have children, she became like a grandmother to that little boy. Well, I wrote an article about the relationships that can develop in urban places where your family is not necessarily your biological family.
Sure,
it can be your
interesting.
surrogate family, and that neighbors can actually become like your family. So I wrote an article about this older woman who was very charming, and this little boy, his dad, and me and my dog. And the article was so popular that my agent said, well, why don't you turn this into a book? Well, I didn't do it right away. I waited 8 years. No sense in rushing, right?
Fair enough.
And when conditions changed, and I won't say what happened, there came a point where I was ready to tell the whole story. And the story begins around 1988. and goes up until the present. And the book is about how one dog has the power to turn 5 neighbors into a family, and it's about what happened over a period of 16 years between this little boy, his dad, the older woman, her husband, and me and my dog. And we go through the adventures of 9/11, and there are losses and deaths and accidents and high points and low points, and it's a very emotional book. And oddly enough, it was my most successful book. I say oddly enough because everything else I've written was about celebrities, and this is just about me and my dog and our experience. But it seemed to hit a chord in people because, there are millions of dog lovers out there. And I produced a book trailer that people can watch on the website. And the website's interactive. If you visit it, you can see all kinds of stuff on there. And there's a book trailer that you can watch if people want to.
Sure, and I'll post the link in the show notes so people can, go through it. They don't need to remember it right now.
Right. Remember, anything that happens to you in life is can be subject for something in your professional life. Like, I took what happened to me personally and I turned it into a book.
Sure.
That was highly meaningful to me. But the book is a product, and actually, it wasn't until that book came out that I learned how to use Twitter and Facebook and stuff like that.
Really?
Up until that point, I wasn't using social media. But to promote this book, the publisher insisted that I get on target, so I did.
So did your agent find you kind of a publisher, or did you have to hustle that yourself?
No. I don't find a publisher myself, the agent.
Okay.
When you have a book idea, after you create your book proposal, in order to sell a book to a commercial publisher, you have to have an agent. Publishers will not buy books from individuals.
Oh, okay.
And so the agent shops the proposal. They send it out to dozens of publishers, and eventually we narrowed down to a good one. In this case, it was an excellent one, Hachette.
Sure.
Hachette. That's the company that has been in lots of legal wrangling with Amazon because there's a question about royalty payments and stuff. But anyway, that's the company that published the Katie Up and Down the Hall book.
Do you still keep in touch with the father and the son? And
Oh, yes. The father now lives in Paris,
oh, wow.
France. The boy, the 3-year-old, is now in his early 20s, going to college.
Oh, wow.
And,
in New York or?
Out in Arizona.
Okay.
And to find out the rest of what happens, you must read the book.
All right. Sounds good. No, that's awesome.
I don't want to give the ending away.
Makes total
but
sense.
It's a fun book, and it came out in hardcover, softcover, ebook, audiobook. So, nowadays there's so many options for how you can even read or listen to a book. Back when I wrote my first book about the musician Horowitz, there was no such thing as an ebook
Sure.
or an audiobook. It was just a book.
Do you have any other upcoming books that you want to talk about, or is it still kind of under wraps?
I'm working on a couple memoirs for people who are writing stories of their lives, and I've also been working on a financial book with someone from the show Shark Tank, ABC
Oh, wow.
TV. It's kind of a self-help book for people about money, and I hope to write another book of my own about subjects that I'm interested in. So I guess the future is an open door, right?
How many projects are you typically kind of working on at one time? I get the scale can be quite different, but, is it 2 or 3? Is it more like 5 or 6? Or is it kind of depending on what you're doing? Or do you try to fit magazine articles in between books? Or
Well, it's never 5 or 6. I prefer actually to do one thing at a time.
Okay.
If I'm writing a book, I actually prefer to just concentrate on that. But recently, for scheduling reasons, I couldn't do that. So over the last 6 months, for example, I was working on 3 different things. I was working on a memoir for a producer who works at CNN. I was working on a financial book, and I was working on a memoir, and I was doing all three things kind of at the same time, shifting gears, between them. Sometimes I'll spend a week just focused on one of these things, and then the next week I'll focus solely on another.
Okay,
And
so you kind of break it up into weekly chunks then?
Sometimes.
Okay.
Sometimes I'll do two things in a day, but I try to just concentrate on one thing at a time. And as far as magazine articles go, I don't do that as much, but the most recent ones were a few long-format interviews for Playboy magazine. The reason I like Playboy is not because of the photographs. It's because they have very long interviews. They're like 8,000 words.
Oh, wow.
And most magazines now are doing much shorter interviews, so you can really do in-depth work. And, everyone from Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy and President Carter and Barbra Streisand and Clint Eastwood and Tom Cruise, everyone has done the Playboy interview. And so it's considered prestigious to do it. There isn't hardly anyone you can think of who hasn't done it at one point or another. And so, for example, I did one with Tony Robbins, and you can include the link in on your show if you like.
Sure, I will.
And that's a particularly good one, because after all, he's the highest paid self-help life coach guru in the world. He makes $30 million a year doing it.
Oh, wow.
And
I didn't realize it was that much.
It is. And so for that reason, I would find him a very interesting interview subject, for the magazine.
Sure.
So we did an interview with him for that.
Playboy reached out to you and said, do you want to interview him, or did you know him?
No. Nobody ever reaches out to me. I come up with all the ideas, and then I reach out to them.
Oh, okay, cool.
No, they don't come to me. Most nowadays in journalism, most of the ideas seem to be generated by, the writer.
Sure.
Sometimes if you work for an organization full-time, which I don't, then you get assignments.
Right.
But as a freelancer, you tend to be more in the idea business,
So do you just work out of the home office, or?
I have a separate office here at home.
Oh, okay.
And
no, that makes sense. Okay.
I actually have two apartments connected, and one of them is an office. So when the day's over, it doesn't take me long to get home, does it?
To be fair, I've never been to New York City. I've been wanting to go for forever. And
you should come and visit.
Oh, I want to go so bad. You have no idea. The goal is probably within the next year to get down there, because I even have a couple buddies out there. So I guess we're kind of getting close to the end of this, and I want to respect your time, but I am curious if there's any other advice that you could give aspiring writers, what to do, what not to do. If you have any advice for people?
Well, I think it's important to first figure out what it is you're most interested in. Work backwards. Start with what really interests you. For example, if you're passionate about politics and you really want to write about politics, then there are lots of websites out there and magazines and that cover politics. One of the quickest ways to get an assignment is go to your local newspaper or a local magazine with an idea and approach them about something that you know that they might be interested in.
Would you go physically down there, or even do you think email works?
Well, going physically down there is a bold move. If you have enough self-confidence and can do it, I wouldn't rule it out. But nowadays it seems as if people are relying a lot on, obviously, on email.
Sure.
But if you don't have any credits even, you can find some radio show that's local, and you can tell them, listen, I can get a great interview with so-and-so. I'm just using politics as one example.
Sure.
Or if you're interested in, rap music, there's ways to get into things. You have to first make an idea about what it is you're most interested in. And then secondly, I think systematically you have to make a list of every possible outlet that could be possibly interested in what you're interested in doing. I used to just call up magazines and newspapers and introduce myself using my book credit and, pitch ideas. But nowadays, it's even easier in a way because with email and websites, the entire world is at your door.
I've reached out to a lot of the people that have agreed to be guests on the show, like yourself. I reached out on social media, like LinkedIn, Twitter. Twitter can even be very casual, where you have like 140 characters to basically say, like what you're doing, you want to be on the show, and then if they're interested, they write back, and you then you start exchanging email, and then you start connecting on social media, where I think LinkedIn's a little bit more formal, at least for me. And sometimes I want that, and sometimes I want it to be a little bit more informal, right? So I kind of try to pick a medium to reach out to people based on kind of almost what I'm looking for, or kind of maybe even the type of person they are, or where I find them most active.
I mean, you write articles for Tech Zulu, right?
Yeah, out of LA, yeah.
And you also, your field is, I guess computer design and is it?
Yeah, well, I'm a creative director at a software company up in Canada. So, I have to reach out to people outside of the city I live in. Like the city I live in is about 1 million people. On the grand scheme of things, it's pretty small. It's not really a big tech hub, but through the radio show and through my writing at Tech Zulu and just my networking on social media, I've been able to reach out to people kind of similar to what you've described throughout the whole show. You come up with an idea, you want to make it happen, you try to figure out who you need to get in contact with until basically happen. I think the other thing too is there's been people I've reached out to that you don't hear back from, that don't or write back like they're not interested. I think rejection is kind of part of the whole struggle of getting kind of what you want at the end of the day.
Yes, there's a certain amount of rejection that does happen, and I guess you have to just develop kind of a thick skin. Well, we had a good time today. I hope I said all the right things. I thought the story about going from music to writing was a good one.
No, totally, it was awesome. This is going to be a great show. So thanks very much for doing it.
It was great, and we'll talk to you soon.
Sounds good. Okay, bye.
Thanks for listening. If you're going to be in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, February 16th and 17th at the Startup Expo and want to meet up and record a show, reach out to me at buildingthefutureshow.com or on Twitter at buildingshow. The music for the show is provided by Electric Mantra. Check them out at electricmantra.com. Until next week.